Good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to a lecture series on collecting art in Imperial Russia. My name is Ekaterina Pravilova. I'm professor of history and acting director of Princeton Center of Russian, Eurasian, East European Studies. So this lecture series is organized and sponsored by our program, Princeton University, as well as the European University in St. Petersburg. And I'm very thankful to my co-organizers, Professor Catherine Phillips from European University in St. Petersburg, and Professor Basil Badev from Princeton and Department of Art and Archaeology. And special thanks to Carol Doak, who is dealing with that logistics and all technicalities of our seminar. I'm very proud and very happy to introduce our speaker today, Professor Wendy Salmon, who will speak about two collections, the icons of Nikolai Likhachev and Ilya Ostroukhov. Professor Salmon was born in New Zealand, and she received her PhD at University of Texas in Austin and now teaches history at Chapman University. She is the leading specialist on Russian art, from icons to modernism. She has written extensively and lectured on the arts and craft movements, on Art Nouveau, and of course on icons and their collections. Her list of publications is very long and includes several books, most prominently Arts and Crafts in Late Imperial Russia, Treasures into Tractors, The Selling of Russia's Cultural Heritage, 1918-1938, Tradition and Transition, Russian Icons in the Age of the Romanovs, and most recently, a fascinating articles about icons in airspace, on air stations and space stations. She is also editing, an editor of a Journal of Icon Studies published by the Museum of Russian Icons, She is currently working on a project, this is a book project, tracing the transformation and the perception and function of icons in Russia from objects of devotion to work of art. And the topic of today's lecture is A Tale of Two Collections, the icons of Nikolai Likhachev and Ilya Ostroukhov. But before we start, I wanted to mention to our audience that this is a webinar. That means that you will not be visible, but you can send us your questions using the Q&A button, which is on the right corner of your screen on the bottom. Please type your question, or you can also use the chat function in the Zoom. And I will read this question to Professor Salmon. So please, Wendy, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya. Let me just get myself up and running. Okay, am I sharing? Am I shared?
Yes.
Okay, great, lovely. Well, thank you so much, Katya, Catherine, and Basil for inviting me. It's a real honor to be with you. A very distinguished company of scholars working on all aspects of Russian collecting. And I'm so pleased I was invited, because it would be such a shame if icons weren't included in this overview that you are putting together. Although I can imagine that it would be easy for icons to just slip out of the picture, because although they're the oldest kind of image making that Russia produced, they're also one of the very last to be considered collectible. So in a sense, my talk today is in some ways addressing this question of the lateness of icons coming to the history of Russian collecting. And I chose the two of all the collectors that got on the icon collecting bandwagon in the last couple of decades before the 1917 revolution. It's these two men, Nikolai Likhachev and Ilya Ostroukhov, whose names keep appearing as kind of bookends or framing devices for thinking about the whole phenomenon that icons became collectible in the late empire. I must say, this rather cheesy title I've given it, A Tale of Two Collections, choosing my title in a rush, has turned out to be quite prophetic. I was just thinking of a way of seeing Likhachev and Ostroukhov as sort of the two towering names when we think about early private icon collecting. But as I've worked on this project for today, it's become more and more apparent to me just how this this mirroring of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities is also embedded in my talk today, because if any collectors more acutely came to represent the collecting culture of Russia's two capitals, it's surely these two men. Likhachev, who was a fixture in the St. Petersburg Archaeological, Scholarly and Academic Committee, and Ostroukhov, who was just as securely a fixture in the Moscow art and museum world. So whether they wanted this to happen or not, I think one of the core ideas of my talk this morning is how two men who began as colleagues, friends, fellow supporters of each other's collecting obsessions, by the end of their lives, they had come to represent the incompatibility of St. Petersburg and Moscow as centers for icon collecting. And I've come to find this actually quite tragic in a small way, and in some ways, perhaps that sense of sadness or the misfortune of this happening maybe tainting a little bit my talk today. Could I also, in addition to thanking you very much for having me here, I'd just like to make a small gesture of thanks to John Emmerich, who right up until the last hours has been scanning me documents from new books that have come in for Russia that are exhibition catalogs of the Likhachev and Ostroukhov collection. So that in itself, both I'm very grateful to John for doing this for me, but it's a really interesting indicator that this era of private collecting is undergoing an enormous resurgence of interest among Russian scholars and museum people today. So it seems appropriate that we're looking at it at the present moment. So here are our two men, our two bookends. And perhaps bookends is not such a good image to use as the lovely idea of two wings of a diptych. This is the image that Abram Efros used to describe the culture of Moscow and St. Petersburg collecting in the early 1920s. So in 1923, in the little sort of underground collector's journal, Sredi Kolлекционеров, Efros described the whole idea that these two capitals bred different collecting cultures. And although he didn't specifically mention icons, I think it's really clear that Ostroukhov's collecting and Likhachev's collectings were by that stage absolutely synonymous with this idea of cultural difference between the two capitals of collecting. So here, this portrait on the left from the mid-20s by Mikhail Verbov shows the Muscovite Ilya Ostroukhov with his artist beret on, itself a giveaway, in front of one of the pearls of his collection, the deposition icon. On the right, Nikolai Likhachev, a little bit earlier, in the study in his St. Petersburg house, looking admiringly, reverently at one of the pearls of his collection, the 13th century sphere icon of Boris and Gleb. But you can also see behind him a fraction of the enormous collection that he put together in the course of his life. And if I tell you here that we can use statistics as a way of just beginning to grapple with the difference in these two collectors' habits. If Ostroukhov, by the end of his life, had collected at most 117 icons, every one carefully curated and thought through and picked out of a lot of other possibilities that were then spurned. Likhachev, by the time he sold his collection to the Russian Museum in 1913, had 1,500 icons. So we're looking at a phenomenon of quality over quantity, one might think. And those criteria alone came to mark how people began to think about these different collecting aesthetic and ethical issues. So here we have our framing of the situation that we'll be looking at. Now, all throughout the Soviet period, and possibly even into the early post-Soviet period, this history of private collecting, the imperial stratum, the underbelly really of this story, was pretty much, in general terms, it was subsumed under official Soviet museum policy. So just as in 1929, when Ostroukhov died, his collection became one of the building block collections of the State Tretyakov Gallery, which opened its collection of Russian icons in 1930. And in the same way, Likhachev's enormous collection became subsumed into the State Russian Museum. So, I mean, this was a standard part of Soviet museum policy that private collecting should essentially be obliterated. This was an unfortunate part of the past with all of the individualism and the eccentricity and the wealth of the collecting classes. And the sooner that we got rid of that memory, that provenance history, the better, essentially, or at least kept it under wraps. So looking at two masterpieces of these two very individual private collections, it's easy to forget that these in their own day, when they started being exhibited and written about and researched and published, for most people, these icons represented very different personal visions on the part of the collector. Ostroukhov and Likhachev came to the fore as private collectors at a time that is variously has been described as the icon boom, the icon Pompeii. Sometimes Alexander Benoit called it that way, as if they were alive at a moment when icons were being unearthed from the rubble of recent Russian history. And so one of the core components here was that through the miracle of a new scientific attitude towards restoration and cleaning, it now became possible for people of the early 20th century to look at icons not as dark, dirty cult images or archaeological deposits, which were impossible to tell one from another, except on the basis of religious tradition. And once restoration got underway, and Ostroukhov and Likhachev were both leaders in this new art of restoring icons, then the veils of the early 20th century person were swept from their eyes. And this became part of the glue that held together the story of early private collecting, with these two men being sort of premier examples. So if we move, right now I'm talking about what they had in common, the commonalities of this moment. Why were they such leading names? They both pioneered the idea that the employment of highly skilled professional icon painters and restorers to take in hand incoming troves of icons which were brought to them from dealers from across the country, and to subject them to these new experimental restoration techniques. And here I'm showing you at the top, these two on the right here, this is Grigory and I think Mikhail Chirikov, Moscow-based icon dealers and painters who became the foremost restorers of their age. And Chirikov did a lot of restoration for Likhachev's collection. And in fact, what we can see here is a schematic diagram from 1913 showing, recording the actual process of what it had taken to get Likhachev's beautiful Boris and Gleb to the state that we saw in the preceding slide. How much had been lost, all the losses around the base, how much had to be repainted or inpainted to bring it to what was considered the state of its original glory. On the bottom here, this is Nikolai Bryagin. Bryagin and his brother Yevgeny, I think there was also a brother Alexander, another family of hereditary icon painters specializing in restoration. And the Bryagins were essentially the in-house restorers for Ilya Ostroukhov down in Moscow. And it was thanks to these men working for this new kind of collector that icons came out from underneath the rubble, from the darkness of time and overpainting and soot and dirt. And this became sort of the talismanic moment of the rebirth of icon paintings, not as cult objects, but as works of art. So this is the sort of moment that these two men are not just part of, but they're very much leading this moment that happens, I would say, if we want to date it, it happens around 1908, right up until World War II. And in that, World War I, sorry. And in that tiny window of opportunity, icons exploded out of their confines into the public consciousness. And this is when a storm of private collecting emerged with these two men at the front. So I'm going to start with of the two men, both, interestingly enough, were almost contemporaries of each other. So here, Nikolai Likhachev, born in 1862, Ostroukhov, born in 1858. So not spring chickens from a early 20th century point of view, but of the two of them, Likhachev was the first to discover icons as a collectible, and this was part of his absolutely obsessive collecting drive. He was a man who lived to collect. We can see him here on the right in his guise as a St. Petersburgian man of consequence. Actually, he came from a Kazan noble family. All of them, it's as if collecting was in the blood of the Likhachev family, but he eventually came to St. Petersburg and started to collect in earnest. So icons became part of his fascination in 1893, but this was just part of a comprehensive seriality of collecting, all of it interconnected. So in addition to icons, he collected seals and signets. He was an expert on heraldry, on diplomatic history, and on paleography, on the history of letters, of paper, of writing. And in each of these collections, he had thousands and thousands of objects. And the point of this collecting, ultimately, was to write history. And I think this is a really important difference right here, that Likhachev was universally recognized as a significant man of erudition and a great scholar, an academician. And his learning was widely deferred to, and in all of these fields of expertise, he was going to write the definitive history. And in order to write that definitive history, he had to have the more material, the better, because with every new addition to his collection, his knowledge base grew, and the complexity of that emerging history became more satisfying. So what I'm showing you on the left here, this wonderful shadowy photo, maybe from 1910 or so, perhaps, while this is him in a tiny part of his St. Petersburg house, with a tiny part of his collection. And you can see it's all sort of piled up cheek by jowl. He is a man, there's really nothing he doesn't like here. One of his sons, when in his memoirs, he recorded how there wasn't a room in the house except where the children slept and where his wife slept that wasn't filled with icons and stuff. You walk through the corridors and the icons were just stacked up all along the corridor. So this gives you a sense of the scale of the collecting and the scale of his ambitions for what he wanted to do with the collecting. So interesting. It's easy to understand, I suppose, that by 1913, why in 1913 he had expended so much money on these collections that he looked at them all and decided that he was in such bad financial shape from having invested in all of this collecting that he had to let his icons go. But up until that point, he traveled all over Russia, collecting from monasteries, buying stuff up on the side, going to dealers. He traveled to Constantinople, he traveled to the Balkans, he traveled to Italy. Everywhere he went, he bought up everything he could find that had to do with his emerging history of Russian icon painting. So this is Likhachev here, already by the early 1900s, really an international authority on icons in the biggest sense of the word, from their beginnings in Byzantium all the way through to Russia. So his acquaintance with Ilya Ostroukhov, his Muscovite counterpart, must have started maybe in the late 1890s. Ostroukhov was an entirely different kettle of fish. He came from a Moscow merchant family. He began his career as an artist, and then he married into the Botkin family. And the Botkins were wealthy tea merchants. And as a result of this marriage, he became a little bit more consequential in terms of his finances, and he was able to begin his own collecting. But it seems like his connections with Likhachev came about through a common interest in all things archaeological. So if Likhachev was a member of the Imperial Archaeological Commission in St. Petersburg, Ostroukhov was a big figure in Moscow, in the Moscow Archaeological Institute. He was on all kinds of committees and commissions to restore churches and frescoes. He had a really vested interest in heritage issues, and so they had this in common. In addition to that, and this is where this photo on the left comes up, he had been a very close friend of the Moscow collector, Pavel Tretyakov. And as a close friend, he became Tretyakov's executor after his death in 1896. And it fell to Tretyakov to figure out what would be done with the collection after he became a member of the board of trustees. And it's in that capacity that his first real collaboration with Likhachev occurred. And at this stage, I should say, so we're here in 1904 when they begin working together. Likhachev has never seen an icon that he liked. He has absolutely zero interest in icons at this point. He's really interested in, as we'll see in a minute, in very different kinds of art. But precisely because he knows that Likhachev is the leading authority, he brought him in, he invited him in 1904 to come in and expertise the small collection of icons that Tretyakov had amassed in the 1890s, shortly before his death. So Tretyakov had bought about 60 or so icons from Moscow dealers, and he had paid enormous sums of money for them, because at that stage, he only wanted the best for his collection. In the early 1890s, the best icons that money could buy were Stroganoff icons. They were these, as we're seeing here on the screen, these were these small, exquisitely painted, and often with clear provenances to the Stroganoff family of the 16th and 17th century. So Tretyakov had collected these icons, but they had never become part of the larger museum that of painting he'd put together. And it was Ostroukhov's vision that finally the Tretyakov's collection would become a museum that told the story of Russian history. And that meant that Russian art history, sorry. And that meant that the icons had to become part of the overall installation. And this was what Ostroukhov masterminded. He invited the painter Viktor Vasnetsov to design wooden cabinets, vitrines, to display the icons in sort of a aesthetically pleasing fashion. And he brought in Likhachev to expertise the whole collection: names, dates, condition, and provenance and place, if possible. And it's sort of impossible now, when we've come to know so much about icons, there's been so much scholarship, to imagine how little was known about them. People were really, anyone interested in icons, they were just groping in the dark to date an icon, to say where it came from. There was so little information available. So Likhachev was the go-to person. He was already working out a kind of the bare bones of icon connoisseurship, you might say. Some of it he had learned from the old believer collectors and dealers that were richly prevalent in Moscow in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And some of it he worked out himself by looking at the emerging Western scientific approaches to connoisseurship. So Likhachev felt that if you could systematically look at the way that the face of the icon was colored, how the paint was applied, how the backgrounds were treated stylistically, the way that the inscriptions, the paleography was treated, and the nature of the board on which the icon was painted. If you could make sort of a study of those differentiating qualities, then it would become possible to create typologies of icons. So he brought a very scientific approach. In 1905, he published for the now the Tretyakov Gallery this short description of the icons of the collection. So really, this is one of the very first catalogs of the Tretyakov Gallery, and it's the first instances in which really anywhere this notion of a coherent history of Russian art emerged. So here already we've got Ostroukhov in Moscow, Likhachev in St. Petersburg, both thinking very big global thoughts about writing history. And it's very clear from this point that for both of them, collecting is tied up with history writing. it's tied up with imagining the history that you think Russian art deserves at a moment where there's almost nothing available. So the pioneering nature of these activities is just really breathtaking when we look back at it. So the following year, or maybe beginning this year, but into 1905, 1906, they didn't exactly collaborate on this, but their interests really paralleled each other. So Ostroukhov, one of his great achievements of 1904 was to work with the icon restorer and painter Gurianov to restore the Andrei Rubrov's Old Testament Trinity icon, which was still in the iconostasis of the main church at the Troitsa Sergeyeva Lavra outside Moscow. And Ostroukhov had really pushed the Moscow Archaeological Commission to get permission to restore this sacred object. And Gurianov, they took off the metal cover. And when they took off the cover, they saw that the whole icon was covered in a 19th century overpainting. So this was an amazing moment. This was considered the only absolutely proven work by the 15th century painter Andrei Rublev. So it was of enormous historical consequence. Gurianov set to work to start removing the layers of dirt and overpaint. And you can see on the left-hand side here, photographs were taken of the process, and you can see the original icon beginning to emerge here. But the further down they got, the more they realized that the icon was significantly damaged. There was a lot of loss underneath. And I think they sort of got cold feet, and they realized that they were not going to be able to display it in this state. And they left it to Gurianov to sort of in-paint some of the losses, put the cover back on again and return it to its former place. But the photographic evidence remained of the icon and what might be underneath it. And this was clearly part of the inspiration for this, for the restoring of all old icons that was to happen a few years later. Now, here is Likhachev eagerly, curiously following this extraordinary experiment in restoration. And in 1906, he gave a lecture to the Imperial Archaeological Commission on the painting style of Andrei Rublev. And here he is again, the great expert, explaining to people how you can tell whether an icon is by Rublev or not. So he's using his knowledge of looking at all the icons he can and collecting as many as he can. And based on that evidence, he's beginning to build up a picture of what the early history of icon painting might have been. But so far, it's all based on icons in their present condition. He has not begun himself yet to restore the icons in his own collection. So now what happens? 1906, we're in 1906. Ostroukhov has still not bought a single icon, as far as we know. So he's interested in restoration very much, but he's not interested in collecting them for himself because they're not aesthetically pleasing objects as far as we're concerned. So we come to the first, really an historic moment, 1906, at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. Sergei Diaghilev and his friends in the St. Petersburg World of Art group, one of the great sort of early 20th century Russian art communities, they invite Likhachev to loan 25 of his icons to a special Russian art section at the Paris Salon d'Automne. So this is one of actually the first launches, modern launches of Russian art as a coherent thing to Western audiences. This beautiful cover of the catalog here on the left, and on the right, one of Likhachev's icons, the washing of the feet, of I think a 16th century icon. And look, he is the go-to person. Moscow was full of icon collections, the Rabushinskys, the Morozovs, the Shukins, lots of people were collecting icons, but Likhachev was the go-to person for the St. Petersburgian World of Art. So they borrowed 35 from his collection. Presumably they went in and chose the best ones. And Diaghilev, this is sort of an aside, but Diaghilev decided to really intensify the impression on the Parisian audience. He hung them on gold brocade backgrounds to really intensify the glamour of this launch. This was clearly really, I think we have to say, the launch of Russian icons on the world stage. But here again, that's the St. Petersburgian collector who gets first dibs on this. So if we, just a couple of words about his collection, that 1,500 is no small number. And you can imagine that it's very difficult to have quality control over a collection of that size. And in fact, quality control was not necessarily Likhachev's priority here. So certainly he had extraordinary things in his collection, like this 14th century icon of the Apostle Thomas, beautifully restored under Likhachev's direction by Mikhail Tulin. But he also had 18th century icons, 19th century icons like this one on the right here, at a time when 19th century icons were modern. There was, you know, from a collector's point of view, why would you collect icons that were just made 50 years ago or 70 years ago or even 10 years ago? And this is the great defining quality actually of Likhachev's collection, and it's what made it so particular, gave it its particular flavor. So not only did he have bookending his own collection from the 14th century to the 19th century, even the 20th, but his great project was not really the qualities of any individual work. It was the totality of the work and the emerging picture that it created. So in 1906, this is one of his first great publications of his icon collection, Materials for a History of Icon Painting. 800 icons in this enormous 2-volume publishing feat. And you can see from the one of the plates on the right here, the aesthetic quality of the whole volume is negligible, I would say. And you can imagine that if you were going to Likhachev to look for icons that really knocked your socks off, you would not have that experience leafing through these folios. It's remarkable how visually unstunning it is to look through these. And in fact, this goes to a key point in his collecting philosophy. And it's quite shocking, I think, for us now that his purpose is not to collect icons as works of art. This is too narrow for his purposes. He writes elsewhere that a real history of icon painting can only be elucidated while simultaneously and jointly studying both good icons and those that are badly painted. So he welcomed the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, the old and the new, because without that, how could you understand the full picture of icons? This was a major point for him, and this is going to become the sticking point for him and the way that he came to be perceived in the emerging sort of Moscow-St. Petersburg clash that came into the world of icons and their study. So here we are in 1910-11. I'm continuing this theme of visually unappealing publications because I think it turns out to be quite important. So Likhachev's great scholarly companion, probably the only person who could match him in erudition about icons in this pre-war period, was Nikodim Kondakov. Kondakov was a giant in the St. Petersburg scholarly academic community. He was not just actually in St. Petersburg or Moscow, but worldwide. He was considered one of the leading Byzantinists. Everyone looked to Kondakov. He was an extraordinary phenomenon. He'd been everywhere, he'd seen everything, and he was a man of just incredible erudition and like a steel trap mind for accumulations of visual data. In 1910, Likhachev and Kondakov both gave lectures at a meeting of the Imperial Archaeological Institute in St. Petersburg. And they had developed this theory together, this hypothesis about the history of Russian icons. And it came out of their collecting and their travel experiences. So they had come to believe that Russian icon painting had certainly begun in Byzantium and come to Russia in the 10th century. And it had followed strictly Byzantine laws up until about the 14th century. And then something amazing happened. Russian icons came under the influence of early Italian Renaissance trends. And they thought that you could prove this by looking at the evolution of icons of the Mother of God. So you could start by looking at, I actually haven't got very good examples here. So you could, their argument essentially was that Byzantine icons were very removed from the human experience, like the Hodegetria model here, where the human is kept, the human being is kind of kept remote. But over the course of time, and as the influence of Italian painting, icons brought into early Italian Renaissance practice, then the human element became increased. And the type of the the type of the Mother of God icon called the tenderness type or the umilienia type began to seep into Russian icon painting practice. And for them, this was a clear sign that the history of Russian icon painting had gone from Byzantium to the Italian Renaissance, and then it came into Russia and became its own thing. This was their Italo-Greek theory, and they loved it. They were just enamored of this theory. They talked about it, they wrote about it, and this became part of the backbone of Likhachev's emerging history of Russian icons. So here we've got a page, these are images from his 1906 work, showing part of his collection of Mother of God icons. And this is a page from his, from the book on the right here, The Historical Significance of Italo-Greek Icon Painting. And again, you can see how obsessed he is, and Kondakov really followed in this, in emerging iconographic types. And he's turning not just to icons, but to seals and signets, following the track of the iconography, that this is how you can build this global picture of the journeying of an idea across time and space. For this purpose, quality was not useful. It is so out of this, I don't want to call it an obsession, but this theory, this beloved theory, Likhachev and Kondakov became known as the fathers of the iconographic school. That really, the idea began to circulate, especially among younger art lovers, that they were not interested in icons for icons, they were interested in them as bearers of iconographic information. And when we come to Ostroukhov, and I see I maybe got 15 minutes left, so I'd better hurry up a little bit here. This is the moment where Ostroukhov comes into the limelight, not from the background making things happen in the protection of heritage, but as someone who actually begins to drive the conversation about what an icon is and how you collect it. So if we come back to his early career, outside, not just as a public art person, but as an artist, he starts off his career, if you remember I said, as an artist himself. And here he is as an early member of the Marmontov Circle at Abramtsevo. Here he is as quite a young man. Here is Sava Marmontov, Mark Antokolsky, Vasily Palyanov, and Valentin Serov, all members of the emerging Muscovite modern art scene. And in fact, Ostroukhov was the author of one of the quintessential works of modern landscape painting, the Northwind, Sivirka, which caught people by storm for its freshness and its modernity when it was shown in 1890. So already, before he's a collector, before he knows Likhachev, he is a member of the Moscow art community. He's also a collector in his own right. So when he came into money after his marriage, he became as much an inveterate collector as Likhachev was, but his collecting habits were very different. So you can see him here in his Moscow house on 17 Trubnikov Lane, surrounded by just a part of his collection. And it's eclectic. It's eclectic in the way that modern aesthetes collected. In fact, someone likened him to the Goncourt brothers, the French 19th century collectors, and you can see how that's so. This is Alexander Galavine, his fellow artist, describing how his contemporaries thought about him as a collector. He was a man who knew quality. He was a person of refined taste. He collected widely and eclectically, but everything he collected was quality. It might not be the biggest paintings or first first quality finished works, but even if it was a little sketch or a tiny figurine, it was top quality. He wouldn't have anything that wasn't beautiful or first rate in his house. So he emerged as a collector, before icons come on the scene, as a man of taste. And he was that new quintessential Muscovite collector, eccentric, slightly bumptious as a person, maybe slightly unethical in the way that he collected things, but he was our Muscovite man. Very different from the cold, calculating, scholarly collector that Likhachev was now starting to emerge as. So November 1909, Ostroukhov buys his first icon. And this is pretty clearly documented by Ostroukhov himself. So this is extraordinary. The man who becomes the epitome of Moscow icon painting waits until 1909 to buy his first icon. This is, others have been collecting for a decade perhaps, but he decides to get in on the scene. And it seems to be the story, that the myth really behind this moment is that one of the Moscow dealers makes him a gift of an icon that he has cleaned. Ostroukhov sees this cleaned early medieval icon, perhaps a Novgorod icon, and the scales fall from his eyes and he falls in love. And from that moment, he begins to collect icons with a fervor that puts all his other collections in the shade. So he is obsessed by icons, not just any icon, but the icon that can be cleaned and restored to its original glory, like this icon of St. George from Novgorod from the first half of the 16th century. So this is, now we're saying that only certain icons are worth collecting. Now here's a strange paradox here. What does he do? He goes back to his friend Likhachev, even though at this moment Likhachev is starting to, look rather old-fashioned, and he asks him to expertise the collection. So this is Likhachev's handwritten list of the icons that he has what he has in the collection as of 1910. And there must be, there are 2 pages, so there must be about 18 icons here. He gives names, he gives dates, he gives place, the place he thinks they come from, and he gives approximate value, market value. Or maybe these are the value, the amount that Ostroukhov paid for them. But so they're still very much on speaking terms. Ostroukhov relies on Likhachev. Likhachev is interested in this new collecting enthusiasm of Ostroukhov. So this is our moment in 1910. To give you an idea, Ostroukhov absolutely, as people started to go to his little Moscow house and see the things that were accumulating there, you can see why this was a visual discovery was made by everyone who went there. So one of his early icons, the prophet Ilya, with this extraordinary red background from Novgorod 1400. Ostroukhov, almost all of his purchases were from the earlier the better, but the 1400s, 1500s, he refused to buy anything that went past the early 1600s, the Stroganoff school. For him, after this, icons ceased to be icons as he understood them. There's no excuse could be made for anything from the later 17th, 18th, or the 19th century. And this is probably one of the latest icons, the Stroganoff icon here. So now we start to see an emerging gap between how he approaches his growing confidence as a collector and his friend and advisor, Likhachev. 1911, another date on our timeline here. Ostroukhov has enough icons in his collection that when the French painter Henri Matisse is invited to Moscow by Sergei Shukin, his collector, to work on some paintings in his house and to advise him on his collecting, Ostroukhov takes Matisse in hand and he decides that he's going to show him the glories of Moscow icon collections, sort of starting with his own collection. He takes Ostroukhov to his house and he shows him what he's got, icons like the one we saw before. And this is part of the letter that he wrote to a friend describing with glee how astonished Matisse was at what he saw at Ostroukhov's house. Then he took him to the Tretyakov gallery and showed him the icons there. Matisse, there are these wonderful records, this correspondence describing this visit. Ostroukhov says, I took him through the whole Tretyakov gallery and he was totally uninterested in the wanderers, in Brulov, in all our great late 18th century portrait painting. When he came to the little icon room, he was in heaven. He opened all the glass cases, he took the icons out, he looked at them. So this is the beginning of this this wonderful story of emerging Russian modernism, where the great French modernist painter Matisse comes to Moscow and he falls in love with our icons. This is a turning point for Ostroukhov, as it is for sort of Russians' own sense of themselves as having a center to their own art history. But it relies not on Likhachev's collection, but on Ostroukhov's collection. At the same time, I repeat the son of paradox here. When Matisse goes back to Moscow, Ostroukhov gives him as a little gift, because there's really apparently nothing else to give him. He gives him a publication by Kondakov, the great iconographer. And one of Kondakov's many irons he has in the fire is working to restore to its former glory the art of contemporary icon painting. And he was part of a publication project to produce facsimile chromolithographs of important early Russian icons that could be used by contemporary craft painters to make icons as they ought to be. So he sent Matisse home with this grandiose project, which comes from an entirely different part of the understanding of icons. But I think it shows that at this moment, even 1911, Kondakov and Ostroukhov are still they're part of one single world of icon understanding. A split has not yet occurred, but the split is going to happen. And in my last few minutes, I'll tell you about the split, because I find it really quite tragic the more I think about it. So September 1912, the young writer and aesthete Pavel Muratov makes a visit to Ostroukhov's house. He's not been there before to see the icon collection. He's just come back from living in Italy for several years, where he's steeped in the art of the Trecento. He's steeped in the beauty of, early Italian art. He goes into the icon rooms, looks at the icons, and he writes to Ostroukhov that, he's had a revelation there, that he's never seen anything more beautiful. This is the best thing that Russia has to offer. Why didn't I know about it? This extraordinary stuff. And if anyone is going to write about this, please let it be me. And that's what happens. Muratov, by 1913, he is beginning to write about Ostroukhov's collection, and this wonderful book, this actually epical book, comes out in 450 copies, his history of early early icon painting in Ostroukhov's collection. So that means Ostroukhov's collection is in itself an entire history of Russian painting, or what is worth looking at. The same year, he also wrote the volume on early Russian icon painting for Igor Grabar's History of Russian Art. So right there, Muratov emerges out of nowhere as the leading expert on icons as they need to be thought about, as we should be thinking about them. Not as Likhachev sees them, but as a new generation of art lovers should see the Russian icon. So this is an absolute turning point. He writes about the icon. In a way, Muratov is one of the most important people for understanding how we understand icons today. In a way, he's given us the language through which we express our delight in icons as works of great art. And he has sort of filtered he's shaped the way that we see them, in fact. So here on the right-hand side is a photograph, possibly maybe a photo from the 20s, showing part of the treasures of Ostroukhov's collection. And in the box I've given you here is one of his great treasures, an icon that was attributed to Dionysi, one of the few known named early icons, the Shestadnev. And this is what Muratov writes about it here. And now you can start to feel the language of an entirely new approach to the icon. The rhythm of the apostles' poses that makes up part of the Shestadnev can only be the legacy of an art that exhausts all possibilities and it involuntarily brings to mind the rhythm of the poses in Raphael's Disputa. So here, the idea of rhythm emerges as a visual quality, a formal quality that emerges out of the icon, and that it's a rhythm that is it competes with Raphael's Disputa, with the High Renaissance, but it's not influenced by it. It's its own language that we can now stand alongside Raphael and feel that we have our own great artistic tradition. What else does he say? Oops, I'm so sorry. Oh, it's not going. So here are three of the great treasures, the three festival icons from an iconostasis. Here we're back again. Look at how he's simultaneously with the art of the Italian Quattrocento. So 15th century Russian painting developed along completely different laws and traditions. It took the stylistic elements taken from Byzantium to a more severe and precise form. So it's analogous to the Quattrocento, but it comes directly from the Byzantine. It never went anywhere near the Italo-Greek theory of Likhachev and Kundakov. It developed to its own beautiful, precise language. And here he begins to use language like the language of Wölflin, the new art history, the new connoisseurship and formalism. So the entry into Jerusalem, he describes it as having pronounced painterliness. The icons on the right, he sees a moving from a painterly quality to one of colored silhouettes. This is the language in which he's looking at them, not in terms of iconography or typology, but in terms of pure painting. And it's this approach that he brings, the sort of laconic, looking at them as paintings, not as part of a iconographic language. This is what he puts in counter-distinction to those St. Petersburgian scholars. 1913, a major event. I mean, truly epical. The huge exhibition of early Russian art at the Delovoi Dvor in Moscow. So Moscow emerges on the scene as a collection from private collectors, including Ostroukhov, Rabushinsky. I think there are 4 icons from Likhachev here, but primarily this is a Moscow gig. And this is when the public got to see icons unveiled, icons restored. And this began the real boom in public interest and in frenetic collecting, because everyone now wanted a piece of the action. You see through Matisse, you see through Muratov, there is now a language of appreciation and a visual experience that now makes icons highly desirable. So the same, now a divide begins to open up between Moscow and St. Petersburg around the idea of the icon. Because 1913, it's the Delovoi Dvor exhibition in Moscow, but it's also the year that Likhachev sells his collection of 1,500 icons to the Russian Museum, or the Alexander III Museum, as it was called at that stage. And he receives 300,000 rubles that comes from the privy purse of the Tsar himself. So this is a very big deal. It's a state deal, it's a public deal, it's an institutional deal. His icons are added to other collections that have been acquired for the museum. And this is one of the installations that's made, one of the primary halls in the museum collection. And interestingly, it has been, at the wish of a private donor, it's been installed to simulate on this wall an actual iconostasis. And they've even commissioned the Khebnikov firm to create a facsimile chandelier, church chandelier, to intensify the feeling of sacred space in this. So from a museum installation point of view, it's a really interesting installation. Here on the right, some of the, see, here's the part of the top of the iconostasis. So they're in the very middle of installation. Who is advising them? Kundakov, Likhachev's friend. He is the advisor in all matters of installation here. And this man here in the middle, this is Pyotr Neradovsky, who was the curator of the early Russian art department at the Russian Museum. So here we have a huge undertaking backed up by lots of resources, many, many icons. And the Russian Museum is now starting to create in museum space its own history of Russian icons. And now we begin to see a divide emerging between the institutional academic space of the northern capital and the charming, eccentric, exquisitely tasteful world of the Moscow private collector. Now we can see, and here is I think, a really quintessential moment here. When, until this moment, the two men had been on very good terms, mutually collaborating. When Ostroukhov found that Likhachev had sold his entire collection to the museum, he was irate. And he wrote in a letter to Neradovsky in 1914. Essentially, he's saying, what on earth were you doing buying all of that work, those, 1,500, but he's saying 1,000 pieces. What you should have done is buy 100 at most. Maybe there were 100 really top quality icons in that collection. You bought all that trash at the same time. No museum needs that. So in a way, you have defiled your collection. You have ruined the potential of your museum as a heartland of the best of Russian icon painting by muddying the waters with all this other stuff. And his nose was also out of joint. Scholars are now just starting to acknowledge this, because he had been trying to advise the museum with his contacts about how to build their collection. And now it's been taken out of his hand and he's cast into the background, essentially. So I think this is the beginning of a really interesting rift that's laid out against city lines. So I think this possibly explains partly why, or in the mid-1910s, not the 20s as I've got here, Ostroukhov builds on an extra space to his Moscow house for the display of his icons. So this is his sketch of how he's going to install them. Here it is installed, another corner of it here. And as I look at this, I got this drawing from yesterday, I saw it for the first time. It seems clear to me that he is doubling down on the new icon rooms at the Russian Museum. If you can do that, I will do this. And when people come to my little collection, it may be small, 10% of what you've got in St. Petersburg, but everything in there is a work of art. There will be nothing here that you look at that you won't be thrilled by, delighted by. I'm coming right to my last slides here, I promise. So now is the moment when war is declared. And I have to say, I think Muratov is responsible for this. And maybe this is an inevitable tragedy. Maybe it's not a tragedy. Muratov at this moment is keen as mustard to assert Moscow's hereditary right to be the homeland of how we think about icons. Moscow is old Russia. And he actually says in a letter, as he looked at the St. Petersburgians getting into icon affairs, he said, Moscow is the place for icons. St. Petersburg's got its palaces. It should just take care of the stuff that it knows about. So we have a war here. In 1914, 2 periodicals come out, short-lived because of the war, both dedicated to the icon. Sophia, edited by Muratov in Moscow, Ruskaya Ikona, edited by Sergei Markovsky in St. Petersburg. And if you do a study of the editorials in both of these, you can really much feel the growing animosity between these two groups. The Muscovites, I think, really fomenting it, taking pot shots at the St. Petersburgians, humiliating them, laughing at them for their lack of aesthetic taste, for their pedantic, scholarly, iconographic ways of thinking about the icon. Publications all throughout, even during the war, publications come out like this by Alexander Grishenko, in which this argument goes on and on. The private collectors in Moscow, that's where you see beautiful icons. St. Petersburg, nothing much. So here's Grishenko talking about the trend of Moscow private collectors. They're all collecting the new Novgorod icons. that they saw in the Ostroukhov collection. And the late things they're not at all interested in. They're not interested in iconography. Nikolai Likhachev, one of Murat's closest friends, talking about, this is Likhachev and Kondakov he's talking about here, like an ant that brings into its house both a speck of gold and a rotten sliver. They don't know what they're buying. They bring in beautiful stuff, they bring in trash. This is a really antagonistic way of thinking about these men of stature. And here again, Shokotov, this is the last word really. This sets the deal in Moscow against St. Petersburg. Ostroukhov, he doesn't want to coldly study, investigate, or examine. He delights in the beauty of the icon. So there we have it right there, Moscow against St. Petersburg. This will be my last slide because I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit over time here. Come the revolution, 1917, everything has changed. Private collections are gone. Private collectors are gone. And this is so for Likhachev in the middle of this photo here and Ostroukhov here flanked. Here they are together in one sort of parting shot. They own nothing anymore. Even though Likhachev's own collections, he'd already sold his icons in 1913, but he lived to see his marvelous, expansive global history broken up when they moved the Greek and Byzantine icons out of the Russian museum into the Hermitage. But according to new Soviet museumology, his view of Russian icon history is no longer valid, so it's destroyed. Ostroukhov, he's allowed to stay in his Moscow house as the director of his museum, but that no longer belongs to him. But what we're seeing here in this last parting photograph, and I've color-coded it for you, is just a tiny indication of how the battle between Moscow and St. Petersburg over who controls the story about icons. It marked the whole early 1920s in the world of icon restoration. And essentially, I think it's marked the way we think about icons ever since. In lilac, in lavender here, are the Muscovites, who took control of the world of Russian icon collecting and the writing of the history of the icon. And they essentially followed in the footsteps of Ostroukhov, saying that the earlier the icon, the better. We have no need anymore for these late icons. The history of icons stops around 1650. The rest of it is irrelevant to our history. The St. Petersburgians, Neradovsky, Likhachev, they are now belonging to an old world that values the total holistic picture of the icon as something living and evolving. And it's that history that gets sacrificed to the Muscovite history after 1917. And I think it goes, I find it quite touching that it starts with these two men collaborating together in sync with each other, and it ends with a battle of the fittest, a rivalry in which there has to be a choice and there cannot be compromise, there cannot be collaboration. So I will stop there, I will stop sharing. I have indulged myself for maybe 5 or 10 minutes too much, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Wow, wow. Thank you so much, Wendy. This was so wonderful. Let me ask a first question. I'm just so interested in what you're saying, this very delicate and sophisticated analysis of this rivalry and competition between the two schools and the two philosophies of icon collecting. But since we've been talking in this year about collecting in general, I also wanted to ask you maybe to zoom out a little bit and speak about other realms of competition. And what comes to my mind is the two other museums, like for instance, the Hermitage and the Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, where you can see just the reverse, because Tsvetaev in Moscow was propagating this scientific approach of collecting plaster copies of art, and actually he was clearly comparing it to these biological museums of collecting the catalogs, like totality, as you said about Likhachev was the philosophy of the Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, whereas Hermitage was very traditional in picking up the supreme, Yes, the most expensive, exquisite items. So does it say something about just the icon being a very special object of collecting, or maybe just the two philosophies that are could be used elsewhere? So what do you think about this?
Gosh, it's such a wonderful question, because, you know, as soon as you think you've pinned something down there and I've got a nice binary going on, although it's not really my binary, it's, in this case, it is their fabricated binary for their own purposes by this little group of Muscovite aesthetes. But your question absolutely says you can't take for granted that it's that's the diptych stereotype that Efros was observing, but of course it's full of holes, just exactly as you say. I think it's the person in charge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are these stereotypes about the Muscovite and the St. Petersburgian, but they only go so far. As you, so Tsvetkov, Tsvetaev, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I really never really looked very much into his collecting, but perhaps he had more that sort of scholarly bent and the ambition of the global history.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the same idea of formalism is in Likhachev is like a writing history in a museum. The museum is a form of historicizing art.
Exactly.
So it was so I was just struck how similar it is to the similarity between Tsvetaev and Likhachev.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we have a few questions. First, Kara Heisen is asking about the methods of collecting and direction of the church. So whether the churches were selling icons and how did they react to this emerging collection of sacred items?
Oh, fantastic loaded question. In fact, much of the history that continues to be written and expanded about this period is about where the icons come from. So they were, as collecting became more fashionable, the tensions between collectors and the church became more complicated. So the collecting at first became possible because churches, in the Orthodox Church, the attitude towards icons, which had become sort of unusable, you know, just too decrepit to be used, it was theologically untenable to destroy them. You couldn't destroy an icon, so they just tended to stockpile them. And there were churches and bell towers and sheds all across Russia that seemed to be full of old icons that were just falling apart. And there were also old churches where there would be icons that were just sitting there and no one paying any attention to them. So when it became clear that collecting was going to be a thing, then a whole industry emerged of these people called afeni, middlemen, who would go out, dealers, and they would just trudge all around the country, picking up boatloads, truckloads of icons and bringing them back and selling them on to these collectors. But the collectors themselves, like both Ostroukhov and Muratov and Likhachev, they all went on summer trips all around the north of Russia buying up stuff. They just bought whatever they could find. It's the passion for acquisition. And that also is poignant because this stuff really was falling apart. They really did save these things from disappearing. But then when the church got in on it, then it sort of staked its ancestral rights to hang on to this. So there were some unfortunate sort of incidences. Even one of these Ostroukhov restorer, Yevgeny Bragin, he was arrested. He was brought to trial for having bought one of these icons and selling it to Ostroukhov. And he served time in prison, actually, because the church brought a case against him for sacrilege. So it's a really interesting question. Church, like church clergy would often do it on the side, under the table, because, you know, who needs this stuff? So it's very complicated.
Right. Thank you. Basil Bade is asking, could you please speak about the documentation process of the conservation of icons by each collector? Did they use photography?
It's mixed, I think. There is and it's it's also muddied. All of these things are muddied because in the 1920s, when the Soviet restoration and collecting machine started to develop, there was a real desire to diminish the achievements of private collectors and all that they had done to restore and bring in new practices. So they didn't like in the 1920s, they didn't like to talk about all the things that had been done before 1917, but there were definitely practices of what could be called scientific documentation. So photography, especially the restoration of the Trinity that I showed you by Gurianov, that was Ostroukhov that made sure that they photographed the stages of the restoration. And I don't know if he did it in his own collection. I've not been into his archive to see. I think there probably is material in there though.
Mm-hmm. And related to it, I wanted to ask, what was the attitude to this technique of ink painting, which certainly is whether there was any criticism of ruining authenticity or maybe modernizing in the process of restoration?
Oh yes, again, like acquisition, one of the central questions that came up about, because there had been a previous generation of collectors, mostly old believers in the 80s and 90s, and they had their icons restored all the time. But they had them restored by a method called antiquarian restoration, where they were made to look the way the collector wanted them. And that meant lots of in-painting or over-painting to make them look like 17th century icons. So that had always been there. And Ostroukhov had to sort of retrain his people, Briagin, to replace over-painting with tonal in-painting. So to make it clear where the old painting and the original and the in-painting, the boundary between them. But I think actually, even for Ostroukhov, I think he let a lot of stuff go by that he didn't. There's a lot of things going on in his icons that are now in the Tretyakov gallery where he didn't know what was, he couldn't tell the difference between the old and the new himself. So it's an emerging science that it's very much experimental at that stage. But
yes,
I haven't answered that very well. It's just such a deep part of the conversation, this whole thing about how they were restored.
Yes, and it's certainly obvious that the science of scientific approach to icons contributed to the restorative techniques and vice versa as well.
Exactly.
We have another question. Could you please tell whether Likhachev and Ostroukhov were interested in the Christian icons produced in the Middle East? How did they approach those icons?
Well, the St. Petersburg, iconographers, the gray men up north, they saw them all as a single history. And Kondakov especially, one of his life works was to write the definitive history of the icon. And so you can see everyone wants to write the definitive history. Mm-hmm. And he was going to write it based on the icons in the Russian Museum. It never got written, even in exile. He was only able to write a small part of it. But he always intended that these were all part of the same story, that he took the global view. You look at the Balkans, you look at, Syria, you look at Greece, you look at Byzantium. You can't really, the sort of parochialism of seeing the Russian icon as a separate thing wasn't interesting to him, actually. It was parochial. And you couldn't really understand it unless you saw all these trends moving in and out of each other transnationally. And only now are scholars starting to realize why these two men were so important, because their legacy was absolutely destroyed by Soviet scholars who didn't want to have to owe anything to the outside world. The purge of St. Petersburg scholars in 1930 or so, that destroyed this whole understanding of it as an integrated history. And really the Muscovite history, which is what fueled Soviet scholarship, is based on this idea of exclusivity, I think.
Yeah, well, I agree with you because for Kondakov, for instance, Russian icon painting was certainly in Russian art was immersed into the development of East and West equally. So this was a question I forgot to mention from Kristina Bekinova, and also David Salkovsky is asking along the same lines about the Balkans and Istanbul's and the expeditions to these places. So what was the attitude to it, and what implication do these expeditions have for the type of history Likhachev wanted to write?
Oh, that's really a lovely question. They were inveterate. They traveled all the time. There was nowhere they didn't go. I mean, Kondakov was just, he was everywhere. The Middle East, Palestine, Syria, Athos. There's just nowhere he didn't go. I don't think he wasn't much of a collector, but Likhachev went to the same places, and everywhere he just went to the antique shops, the dealers, the flea markets, the churches, and he bought everything he could buy. He just totally comprehensive. And they anywhere, any Orthodox land, they went to. I mean, they went other places too, but they were interested in the totality of sort of the Orthodox icon, I think.
And we'll take a last question from Isabel Stockholm Romanova. She's joining us from Moscow.
Oh, lovely.
She's asking, could you please say a little more on the response among Europeans to Digilev's icon display at the Salon d'Automne in 1906, and what, if anything, came from Matisse's delights at seeing Moscow's icon collections?
Such a good question. And a shadowy one, because even though this is sort of part of the mythology of Russia discovering its own icons, or even Matisse was impressed, I have not seen any evidence that any European remarked on the icons at the Salon d'Automne. I mean, it's even Russian. They just, at most they will say, "Oh, and there was an icon room. Isn't that interesting?" But I've never seen a photograph of it. Of the display. I've never seen any response to it. And it may be because his icons were not restored yet. Perhaps if they'd been cleaned, they would have made the impact that they made on Matisse in 1911. The second part of your question, the result, I think, first and foremost, is a precious body of Matisse's own writing about what an impact they made on him. And that has become like a jewel, a treasure to be held by Russians about even the great Matisse. Saw these are head and shoulders above the art of any other country. Essentially, that's what he was saying. Whether you can see an actual, direct impact in his art, I think is harder to say and not even maybe necessary, but this is the time he's also looking at, art in Algiers, Morocco, arabesques, anything so-called primitive is of interest to him. This is his acknowledgement that this is the grandeur of the primitive, I think. And
well, again, thank you so much for this fantastic lecture. We have so many comments congratulating you on this amazing research and thanking you. But before we conclude, let me announce our next and final event in the lecture series. On April 22nd, Roman Grigoriev from St. Petersburg Hermitage Museum and European University in St. Petersburg will speak on Rembrandt in Russia in the 19th century, prints and their collections. And another reminder that this lecture has been recorded is all other lectures in this lecture series. So if you want to re-watch it, re-listen, or if you missed something, you can always come back, and then on the web page of our program, you can find a video recording of lectures. Thank you so much again, and I hope to see you in our events again. Thank you.